So yesterday, a Democratic internal poll was released, and it showed us a behind-the-scenes look at how bad the country is viewing Joe Biden after the fallout of his performance. Because not only is he losing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada, important swing states by a large margin, he's also losing states that should be comfortably Democratic states, places like New Hampshire, Virginia, New Mexico, and even places like Maine, Minnesota, and Colorado are now considered competitive based on this internal polling. Again, this polling was not public. This wasn't supposed to be released, but there was some sort of a leak, and now we have access to these polls, and the fallout has been extraordinary. So we're going to talk about what these polls mean going forward for Joe Biden, what they mean for the election as a whole, and whether or not this is too big of a surge for Donald Trump too early, and how likely this could impact Joe Biden's decision whether or not to stay in the race or not. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So this internal poll is really bad news for Joe Biden. In states like Pennsylvania, which in the RCP average, Trump is only leading by 3. In the Democratic internals, Trump was leading by 5 before the debate. Now he's leading by over 7. Nevada, which has been a state that's polled pretty well for Donald Trump over the past few months or so. Trump was up in this state by 7 points pre-debate. Now he's up by nearly 9. Arizona is almost a 10-point margin. Georgia and North Carolina are over 10. So those states are basically gone if this poll is to be believed. They're basically outside, well outside the margin of error. And if the election were held today, Donald Trump would win them comfortably. So this is the map you get when you put all of those poll numbers exactly into account. Now, I've taken some liberty in categorizing some of the bluer states because I think those states naturally would shift more towards Donald Trump given these poll numbers in important swing states. Because if Donald Trump is winning a state like Pennsylvania by 7, he's probably going to be getting close in places like New Jersey, Delaware, so on and so forth. So I've moved some of the other blue states in a closer category. But this result right here would be the biggest landslide for a presidential candidate since Barack Obama in 2008. 335 electoral votes for Donald Trump, just 203 for Joe Biden. So we're actually looking at a situation where Joe Biden could potentially get under 200 electoral votes. And just a few months ago, I would have thought that situation would have been unthinkable. But now, given what the Democratic internal polls are telling us, this is incredibly alarming for the Democrats. And that's why, as we talked about yesterday, there's a number of high-profile Democrats jumping forward and saying that Joe Biden has to step down. He cannot be the Democratic nominee because with these numbers, it's absolutely apocalyptic for the Democratic Party, because if Joe Biden is losing by this much on the presidential level, you can all but guarantee he's going to lose the Senate by a decent amount, and he's going to lose the House. So this would be disastrous. And a lot of the Democrats that are calling for Joe Biden to leave and step aside are the Democrats that are going to be impacted the most by his decision to stay in the race, because swing state Democrats are going to be incredibly vulnerable. If Donald Trump is winning the state of Pennsylvania by 7, Bob Casey is going to lose. You know, if Michigan is going to Donald Trump by 6, 7 points, Slotkin is going to lose, so on and so forth. So this is terrible news for Democrats and really good news for Donald Trump. And my advice for Donald Trump would be to do absolutely nothing. Let the Democrats just implode as they're doing and don't say anything, because right now the attention is taken off Donald Trump, it's taken off of his legal problems, and it's put on to Joe Biden and the Democrats front and center. So that's really where you want the attention to be, because if this is a referendum on Joe Biden's last 4 years, which it, given the fact that he's an incumbent president, it should be, Donald Trump is going to win that argument at the end of the day. If it's a referendum on Donald Trump, then you could see Joe Biden potentially squeak by a victory. Now, again, there's still several months to go. We have all of July, August, September, and October, 4 full months before the election. So a lot of people that think that Joe Biden is out of the race at this point, I think that's very premature, because we still have a lot of time for things to happen. But, some have called this the black swan event of the political campaign, because this was sort of the debate performance that Joe Biden had a week ago that a lot of people were expecting back in 2020. And Joe Biden was actually surprisingly strong in that debate, and it was Donald Trump who floundered. This time around, it's a very different story. Joe Biden had the worst performance he probably could have, and now you're basically seeing an open revolt in the Democratic ranks to make somebody else the nominee. Now, the front and center candidate that would probably be considered first is Kamala Harris, simply because she already is the vice president. The Democrats snubbing her so openly could potentially hurt them with black voters, especially black female voters, who Kamala Harris is very popular with. So that's obviously an option. You also have some swing state governors who could potentially be strong contenders. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan. Now, I would say first and foremost that I think Josh Shapiro would probably not run just because he just got elected back in January of 2023. That's when he assumed office. But Gretchen Whitmer's been in office since 2019, so very likely she would be a strong contender. Gavin Newsom certainly wants to jump in. So you have a number of high-profile Democrats that I'm sure behind the scenes are sort of making their pitch to the Democratic Convention, which will be happening in August. And, this is a very chaotic election year. This is something that, again, a few months ago, probably couldn't have been seen. The right has been talking about Democrats wanting to replace Joe Biden for years now, and this is the only time where it seems like it could be remotely possible. Now, as I've said before, I still don't think it's likely to happen, which for Republicans is very good news, because if they stick with Joe Biden, this lingering sense of Joe Biden being weak, senile, too old, those things are going to continue to stay. Whereas if you have another Democratic nominee, it's almost sort of a blank slate. And, especially if it's somebody like Whitmer or Newsom, they don't really have as much of a national profile, which will allow voters to sort of make up their minds about them. Whereas Joe Biden, their minds are made up. Just take a look at the job approval of Joe Biden. He's underwater by 20 points among the national electorate. If we scroll down to the crosstabs among young voters, he's underwater 60 to 27. You cannot win as a Democratic nominee doing this poorly with young voters. So I suspect a lot of these people are just going to stay home. You're obviously going to have sort of the ideological, progressive college types that are going to make sure they go out to stop Donald Trump. But, I think there's going to be a lot of young voters that are just completely apathetic with the election, and that's a really good sign for Donald Trump. 65 and plus, he's underwater with by 10 points, which I've been meaning to make a video about the 65 and plus demographic because for whatever reason, they're actually the most pro-Biden demographic in the entire country, which based on previous conventional political wisdom is sort of an anomaly because, when you go back to 2016 or even 2020, 2012, 2008, older voters were always sort of rank and file Republicans. And now you're sort of seeing that the older crop that's coming about is a bit more liberal than the older voters we saw back in 2016 and even 2020. Even among Democrats, only 75% of Democratic voters approve of Joe Biden. 13 disapprove, and I guess you have the other 12% that are unsure. Republicans, obviously. But independents, 40 points underwater with independents. You could see why so many Democrats want to replace Joe Biden. If we look at the RCP average, Donald Trump is now up by 3 points in the RCP average. Over the past few weeks, his number was a lot lower. He was at like 1.5, 1. It was getting considerably close. And after the debate, I think Trump's poll numbers have just soared. I think a lot of independent voters are realizing that the real choice is between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And for a lot of people now, they can't pull the lever for Joe Biden. They don't think he's capable enough to be president. And that's really being shown in a lot of these polls, and especially this Democratic internal poll, which this is not public information. So this goes to show you that the Democrats are in full panic mode. And whoever leaked this, I think, wanted the public to know how dire the situation was. Because in that way, maybe they could sort of convince more of the establishment Democrats to throw Joe Biden under the bus and sort of move him out of the way. Because Joe Biden's stubbornness to stay in the race is really hurting Democrats. And the fact that we're even talking about New Mexico, Virginia, New Hampshire seriously being competitive in 2024 is a huge about-face from where we were just a few months ago. I mean, these are states that voted for Joe Biden in some cases by double digits. Virginia, 10.1 margin for Joe Biden. New Mexico, 10.8. New Hampshire, 7.3. These were pretty comfortable margins for Joe Biden. And if this was a normal election year with a normal Democrat, these states really wouldn't be competitive. It's only really because Joe Biden is the nominee and he's really shown that age has just taken a massive toll on his health that a lot of voters are now second guessing it. So, even these Democratic voters who may not be a fan of Donald Trump, these independents, I should say, that vote Democrat, might pull the lever for Trump or might just stay home. But either way, that's a good sign for Donald Trump going forward. And again, if we take a look at Joe Biden's state approvals, they're starting to correlate more with what we're seeing in the internal polls. If we take a look at Virginia, Joe Biden's underwater by 15 points. So it would make sense that Virginia is now starting to be competitive. And according to the internal polls, Donald Trump is actually leading in Virginia by around half a point. New Mexico, Joe Biden's approval rating here is underwater by 13 points. So it makes sense that the state is now, again, according to the internal poll, going to Donald Trump. Minnesota, which oddly enough, this internal poll sort of shows something that I think is kind of remarkable, because Minnesota almost voted for Trump in 2016 and was a closer state than Virginia was in 2020. But I guess sort of that ancestral Democratic identity in Minnesota is very hard to shake off. And even a place like Virginia, which hasn't voted for a Republican nominee for president in 20 years now, is more likely to vote for Donald Trump than Minnesota. And this could vindicate Republicans' efforts increasingly with Donald Trump doing his rally here in Virginia to focus more on the state, because these Dem internal polls basically tell us that it's a lot more competitive than even the public polls, RCP, etc. So really shocking development in the 2024 presidential race. Tomorrow, I'll finally be doing my first Trump-Biden prediction in a long time. I really have been avoiding sort of the election predictions, but I figure now's the time since we had a massive shakeup and we haven't done one in a while, so stay tuned for that. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next